does work. All right, we're a little bit late, but we're going to call the committee of the whole meeting for September 12th to order. Please call the roll.
Alderman Strelchuk is absent. Alderman Telako? Alderman Meyer? Here. Alderman Hancher?
Here.
Alderman Bach?
Here.
Alderman Parrish?
Here.
Alderman Schneider?
Here.
Alderman Gebhardt?
Here.
And Mayor Nurbin.
Here. First up, we have the meeting minutes from August 8th.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any comments, corrections? Hearing and seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? And the minutes are approved. Next, we have a discussion on a review and discussion regarding the proposed amendments to Chapter 62 of the Mequon Municipal Code for the sign code. And our city attorney is going to give us an overview and a bit of a history lesson.
Certainly, thank you. Good evening, Council. Just to kind of give you a little signpost, if you will, as to where we're going, pun intended in this case. We're going to talk a little bit just very quickly about some of the history, how we got here. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth of some of the legal issues that we're facing and that are involved in the process. Then we're going to dive right in to talk about some of the changes that are being proposed within the sign code itself. And then lastly, to wrap it up with some policy input and discussion from the council in terms of where we're at. So in terms of history, really it ended up being a little bit of a perfect storm. We had kind of a combination of a number of things that ended up causing a number of concerns for us. We had some significant changes in case law. There's the Pewaukee case there that really dealt with political signs, campaign signs, really basically says that you can't regulate those at all in any real meaningful way. The Reed case is kind of preeminent case recently that really turned First Amendment law, at least as it related to government regulation of First Amendment, kind of on its ear, and we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the legal section. In addition to that, we had kind of political firestorms all over. We went from recall elections to school board referendums to Trump and Biden and signs related to that and complaints all over the place about, this sign is offensive or not offensive or they've got too many or whatever the case may be. We also had some statutory pressures that ended up coming to bear. The legislature made some changes in what they called the developers bill that changed some of the regulations that we have as it related to some development signage. And then lastly, and as part of that referendum process, we did receive a threat that an entity, an individual was going to sue us because of our regulations as it related to signs on public property and in the right-of-way. And so all of that caused us to effectively kind of call a little bit of a timeout. We immediately jumped on the regulation of signs within the right-of-way and public property. A number of you were on the council at that time, although I think we've got, 4 of you that maybe are new and weren't really necessarily part of that process, although at least one of you was on Plan Commission when it went through there. So at least a little bit of history there. That section, when we adopted it, was really adopted as its own section, intended to stand completely on its own until we were able to go through the full process. And as you'll see when we get into the legal background, one of the concerns that we had moving forward was how the Reed case was going to impact things like how we dealt with commercial signage. If the Reed case ended up being applied to commercial signage in the way that we all feared, it would have required a significant update to the code. Things that we currently regulate and historically have regulated would just not be possible anymore. Little preview, as we'll see, thankfully we didn't have to go that far. The Supreme Court and the Seventh Circuit did preserve a lot of our regulatory rights with respect to commercial signage, so the task did not need to be nearly as monumental as it could have been. With respect to kind of the legal background, I think all of us are kind of familiar with the saying that you can't yell fire in a movie theater. That there are some regulations that obviously can be imposed upon free speech. That in the best case scenario is a situation that the courts basically apply what they call intermediate scrutiny. Intermediate scrutiny it basically deals with the circumstance where you have a content neutral regulation that is narrowly tailored to a governmental interest, and that you have ample alternatives or channels for speech to otherwise take place. Content neutral generally is the things that we call time, place, and manner. The times that you're regulating speech, the locations of speech, the manner in most cases that speech is made. What is not content neutral is where you're actually picking winners in a sense. That you would say that we would allow, for example, a pro-recall sign but deny anti-recall signs in a particular location. Likewise, types of speech a lot of times can be part of that too. There's a case, for example, out of the D.C. area where District of Columbia had passed a regulation that said that you can't, in a sign, say bad things about other countries. That basically other countries were offended that we would say bad things about them in front of their embassies and that kind of stuff. And they passed a regulation to try to calm the waves. And the court said, nope, that type of speech regulation isn't appropriate as well. So the Reed case, as I said, really kind of turned what we knew on its ear. Before Reed, we typically were able to regulate messages that were content-based, provided that we weren't discriminatory towards any certain particular message. So in other words, as long as you were not picking winners, that a lot of what otherwise were considered to be content-based type distinctions were permissible. So for example, you could do a regulation that would say, you can have a real estate sign in front of your house for only 3 months, and then after that you have to take the real estate sign down. That is a clear regulation that's based on the content, a sign that is based for real estate, but those types of things were otherwise allowed. What Reed basically did is said, no, you guys have this all wrong, that the First Amendment actually protects those circumstances where you are regulating that content-based distinction. Effectively what they say in short, as we say on the slide, that if you have to look at the message on the sign to determine what type of sign it is, that in and of itself is a content-based distinction, and that runs afoul of the First Amendment. Clearly a change from the historical perspective that had taken place. And as I said, there were a number of impacts to that. Traditional regulations that we had became questionable. Regulation of real estate signs, regulation of rummage sale signs, political campaign signs, although that really had at least locally been taken care of by that Pewaukee case that I mentioned earlier. But on a nationwide level, that certainly applies. All of those are now controlled by what the courts call strict scrutiny, which says that you have to have a compelling or a very strong interest in regulating whatever the content that you're looking to regulate. It also has to be very narrowly tailored. You have to pinpoint exactly what you're talking about. You can't have a broad-based regulation that just happens to impact a particular area of speech. And then the piece that's virtually impossible to meet from a government's perspective is that it has to be the least restrictive means in order for you to regulate that content. The courts basically, there's very few instances where the courts have said this is a least restrictive type circumstance, and so it becomes very difficult. As I kind of previewed a moment ago, the biggest unknown for us, though, was how Reed really impacted commercial signs. and the regulation of that. Historically, commercial signs had been afforded that intermediate scrutiny that we talked about, even though it was clearly a content-based distinction. I mean, nobody doubted that as it related to commercial signs, but they were nonetheless afforded the intermediate scrutiny, primarily because commercial signage, in the court's view, does tend to be different. There's a greater possibility of misrepresentations that take place. There is far greater possibilities that you're going to have excessive signage in locations that creates distractions for roadways, those types of concerns. And so the courts have generally applied that intermediate scrutiny to it. Obviously, if Reed came into play and said, nope, we mean it, all of that went out the window in terms of what was going on. And so it caused us to really kind of pause a little bit, because there were 4 different First Amendment commercial regulation lawsuits that were pending in the various courts throughout the country, including a court case out of Madison that was in the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals at the federal level, and then also a case that was out of Austin that was in the Supreme Court docket for consideration. And so wanted to see how those kind of played out before we made any significant determinations of how to deal with things. Ultimately, those cases saved the day for us. Both the 7th Circuit and the U.S. Supreme Court, in those 2 cases I just mentioned, ultimately did say, no, nothing has changed. Commercial regulations continue to be subject to that intermediate level of scrutiny, and things kind of go on from there. So with that in mind, we drafted a number of code updates that were in the packet. As I kind of indicate in the memo, the idea for this evening is just to kind of give you the broad-based, high-level, here's what we're thinking. Some of the more detailed things will come at a future point. We'll go through the Planning Commission process and deal with, there are a number of policy-related issues that staff have identified that we'd like to update. If we're going to touch the sign code, we might as well touch it and cover all of it. We didn't include that as part of this process because we wanted to make sure that we were identifying, here's the changes that we really need to be compliant with Reed and the 7th Circuit and the U.S. Supreme Court on the commercial signage, and then to deal with the policy issues coming forward. And so, as I highlighted earlier, one of the conclusions of this discussion will be just to kind of get some input on some policy issues that we are aware of, and then just to see if there's anything else that has concerns for you folks. So as we go specifically to the proposed language, in the initial part, and you'll see on the slide here, I try to reference where in the packet page it starts. So the page number is the packet page for the benefit of all of you if you want to look at it and follow along. But effectively in the findings, the purpose, and the definitions, we really greatly expanded and clarified the findings in the purpose section. These sections really become critical if we were to get challenged because as we've just talked about, both intermediate and strict scrutiny do ultimately consider the purpose of the regulation. What are we regulating? Why are we regulating? And how are we attempting to do that? And so those findings and that purpose really help us to define those purposes in a way that is consistent with other cases where the regulations have been upheld. And so we tried to take that into account as we expanded the various purposes and findings that we identify. With respect to the definitions, the biggest change is just that we combined all of the definitions into one section. We had a couple instances of sections of the code where we had specific definitions within that. We just put it all in one section just to make it consistent. And then we went through and we eliminated any of the content-based definitions that were present. So for example, we used to have a definition for a real estate sign. We don't need that anymore because we don't specifically regulate real estate signs. So we get rid of all of those content-based distinctions that are there as part of that definition process. Moving on, in the permits section, the prohibited signs section, and the exemptions section, the permits, there wasn't a whole lot of change there. We really just clarified and streamlined the code language just to make it a little bit more clear about how that process works. With respect to the prohibited signs and the exemptions, significant changes in these locations, especially as it relates to the exemptions. In a lot of cases, the provisions that were in the existing code were consolidated with other sections. So, for example, sub 22 there in the prohibited signs deals with regulations of signs within public right-of-way and on public property. Obviously, that's all part of the regulations that we just adopted last year as it related to public property and right-of-way signs. And so we didn't need to have them in both locations, so we eliminated it or consolidated it. We also eliminated specific content-based language again. We did clarify and eliminate certain problematic language, things that from a regulatory standpoint maybe are not necessarily an issue with Reed, for example, but things that just created problems for us as we look to enforce. So one example of that is we had a code provision that said that you can't have a sign that contained a misstatement or an untrue statement. Never in my life would I have figured that that would have been a problem. Obviously, over the last couple of years with COVID and all of the politics that have associated with it, what we used to think was an objective fact sometimes doesn't appear to be. And we had individuals that would point to that provision and say, you need to force them to take that sign down because it's not true. It's just a fight that we don't need to have. And so we eliminated that type of language as part of the process. And then lastly, we did add one exemption to the exemption list. We took a whole bunch out, but we did add one, basically for signs that are allowed by other laws. That language was really designed specifically to deal with that developers bill that we just talked about, where they said that developers basically can put a construction sign all the way around the fence of their property, and there's no regulations that we can have to deal with that as part of it. So we just exempt those types of restrictions, primarily because I'm not sure that the state under Reed can even make that distinction, but that's not our fight to have. That's ultimately the state's fight to have. So that's part of that. Another area where we saw some significant changes is basically how we deal with permitted signs in general. We basically split it into three sections: signs that are related to residential properties and residential areas, signs that are related to public property and right-of-way, and then signs that are related to commercial properties. With respect to the residential areas, we really stepped back from most regulations there. Almost everything that we regulated in residential areas was a content-based distinction. Real estate signs, political campaign signs, all of those types of signs that were part of it. And so we really stepped back from that type of regulation, and we make our limitations purely that time, place, and manner restrictions. That you can have temporary signs. The code talks about that being up to 4 months, although how you regulate whether it's been there 4 months or 5 months is a little bit difficult. So realistically, it's more of the intent of the sign as opposed to how long the sign has actually been there. But the primary thing is that you can have a maximum of 15 square feet of signage. That can be one big sign of 15 square feet, or it can be a number of smaller signs that amount to a total of 15 feet, and no one sign can exceed the height of 4 feet. That language actually did go through public welfare in the fall. We did start talking about that, and that really came out of the Public Welfare Committee's recommendations based on what they felt they were comfortable with. We do in residential areas have some commercial or directional type signage that we continue to allow, building names or addresses, subdivision monuments, and then the provisions of home occupations. None of those code regulations change from the existing. We just put them within the residential area to just clarify the process. public property and right-of-way, there we really just integrated it in the full code. As I mentioned before, we had adopted it separately to keep it separate while we were working on the rest of it. Now that we've touched the rest of it, we've just integrated it within the full code as part of that. For non-residential areas, we made a couple changes. First, we incorporated sections that were kind of freestanding otherwise. So we incorporated, for example, the freestanding section that dealt with signs facing I-43. As well as a freestanding section that dealt with some agricultural farm signs, and we just incorporated those into that section. No significant changes to those provisions itself, other than just the incorporation into the non-residential section. We likewise removed a lot of the content-based language that was there. For example, there's a provision that talks specifically about religious signs. That would be a big red flag under Read, and that's not commercial speech per se. And so all of those regulations we took out of the religious context and instead just classified them for all properties in the IPS zoning district, the institutional and park district, basically, as part of that. Likewise, special event signs become a little bit problematic because it may or may not be commercial, so we just generally put those in a category that classified them as general temporary signs, and some regulations that related to that. And then the last thing that we did do is I did address one policy issue that I knew existed, and that dealt with a circumstance where we had a proposal where there was a building that had basically a wall of windows, and there was a question under the code about whether or not the code, which allowed up to 25% of the window area to be covered, if that meant the individual windows or the whole wall of windows effectively. And we did clarify that to say that it's the individual windows that we count, and that you can't take advantage of 25% in multiple windows to make a bigger picture or bigger sign. That's part of that. So we did address that one policy issue that was part of that. So with that, talk just very briefly about some policy input and discussion. In terms of the policy input, I kind of highlighted a little bit of this in the memo in terms of the where we go. The first is in the public property section. We did retain, those of you who were on the council at the time, this concept of the blue kind of directional signs. We have a number of these historically within the community that it's basically a sign that says, the country club is this way, or the gun range is that way, or the church is over here. Those types of signs. At the time that we adopted it, there was significant concern on certainly my part, and I think some of the council members about, hey, does this maybe create a distinction of content base that maybe becomes problematic? I'm not here to say whether or not we want to change that for sure or not. What I can tell you is that we haven't had anybody apply for one yet. So there's not a whole lot of individual.
Well, we've had the renewal for those that we notified were going to be taken down.
Right.
So no new ones.
No new ones. There are the handful that we knew existed that have done. For example, the gun range on the southwest corner of the city did go through that renewal process for their sign, but we haven't had any new applications for additional signs in any locations. Likewise, within the commercial signage section of the code, we do make a couple distinctions that are not necessarily based on its location within a commercial district, for example, but specify specific uses. For theaters and concert halls, for example, we authorize them to have a marquee sign, which kind of makes sense. I mean, a theater without a marquee sign is kind of silly, but it is a distinction that doesn't appear to be necessarily rooted in any particular reason why we're looking to regulate things. Likewise, with gas stations, within the electronic sign section, we allow gas stations to have signs that have prices that change. Again, makes sense. Be kind of silly to have a gas station without a sign that advertises prices. It's kind of what they do, but it is potentially a distinction that might run afoul of the Reed case. And then lastly, with restaurants, we talk about sidewalk signs or sandwich boards. Again, why does a restaurant get those types of signs versus some other particular type of commercial use within an area? So I think at least with respect to the commercial signage, you have a couple options. The first would be you just don't allow those distinctions at all, and you just don't allow them. The other option would be to just open it up broader to say everything within that commercial district is able to use those. Or the third one is that you could tie it to a specific zoning district. And I think that at least my recommendation for those is that for marquee signs, I think you just do away with that regulation altogether. I don't think that theaters, concert halls, it's not a big use that we have here. Certainly a marquee sign, is helpful maybe on State Street in Madison where you're walking under it and, oh, there's the sign. I think probably most people that go to a theater or a concert hall here in Mequon probably know what's there and aren't drawn in by the fact that there's a sign. So I would get rid of that one. Gas station signs, I think that's one that in my recommendation, you just roll the dice on. There is maybe a little bit of risk that's an unfair classification. I just don't know of another good way to deal with that. It's such a specific use, and it's really more of an informational sign, a directional sign, if you will, than anything. And I don't have a great way of doing it, and so I think you leave that one in place. And then as it relates to sidewalk signs and sandwich boards, there I think you use that last option. You tie it to specific zoning districts. For example, you might allow them more, and I may get yelled at by Kim behind me here, but maybe you allow it more in the town center district where it's more walkable, and you don't allow them in places like along Port Washington Road where it's maybe not as walkable, or maybe you flip that, depending on the purposes. But I think you could allow a broader range of potential users to have those types of signs, but you just key it into specific locations that you might want to do it. And that's where we're at. So those would be the areas that we're looking for specific input at this point. And then, as I said, if there are other areas that the council does, there's signs that have concerned you about, hey, why do we allow those, or just general concerns about signs in general, we can certainly talk about those. And then, as I say, those will be put together, packaged with the other greater policy discussions that will then be taken to Plan Commission and then ultimately come back to the council for approval, likely in the November, December timeframe is what we're looking at.
Thank you. I think we'll open it up for some questions and comment. Does anyone have any reaction they'd like to share with City Attorney? I know it's a lot to digest, especially if you weren't here a couple of years ago for round one. I'm not seeing any takers. At the risk of thinking out loud here, for some of those outliers in the commercial districts, would it be another way to handle that, to put them in a bucket and say you need a master sign plan for a site, so there's still some ability to exercise control without prohibiting them but not letting it go wide open either? And I realize you may not have an answer for that because I just surprised you with that. And certainly this we're not taking any final action here tonight. This goes to Planning Commission and will come back to us, so there's time to catch up with it.
It's certainly a good idea, one that I'll contemplate in light of some of the case law, but that may be a good solution, actually.
Okay, I'm just thinking of ways to not totally prohibit things, but give some level of control, so it just doesn't. I think what no one wants is for signs to just explode because we stopped regulating it at all. But in some instances, if we were to tell the gas stations you got to get rid of your signs, there'd probably be some sort of revolt, rightfully so, there as well.
And certainly the other thing that I will offer, recognizing that those of you who are on the council went through a lot of discussion. I mean, this was a multiple meeting thing that we went through. You new folks, you're just kind of getting it all at once. You know, if as you've reviewed this, or even as you look at it after the discussion this evening, if you do have questions, concerns, just you're not understanding something, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to work through any questions or issues that you might have as well.
Alderman Meyer.
Yeah, and in 6218, that sign plan as a whole, individual specific signs within it. Correct. Now, obviously, I mean, you may object to the whole sign plan because of an individual sign, you know, which would certainly be one of the reasons why you could look to confirm that master sign plan. But the idea would be that it's the whole plan that we're reviewing. Not, you couldn't object to just one specific sign individually and say everything else is okay. You'd no, I think, and Ms. Tollefson can correct me if I get this wrong. I mean, it's historically been used in the same way that we confirm some other actions of the Plan Commission, where they grant an approval that is basically notice to the council that, hey, we've taken this action, and then the two members of the council can say, hey, I don't know that we agree with that. Let's have the council look at that before we formally grant that approval. So.
The sign comes through the planning commission and two council members don't agree with that, they can bring that up.
Well, sign plan. Sign plan is a specific.
Their plan for the sign, for a business that's going in.
Right. The master sign plan is a broader based where you have, you know, so for example, Concordia, where you have signs all over the property, has a master sign plan to deal with all of the various different signs on the property.
So they have a master sign plan for their, the same thing as that if there's a big business comes in, must have a master sign plan. So that's what you're saying.
Right.
It's kind of the same thing as saying it's an individual one that comes through on it, but it's also, does it pretend upon just the plan itself, or does it have to be with a waiver that's granted inside of it for us to bring it up?
This language would relate only to those master sign plan approvals, not so like if there was just a waiver that was granted to a sign, or the plan commission approved a particular sign outside of the master sign plan process, that would not be covered by this. It would only be where the plan commission is granted an approval for a master sign plan, the full plan itself.
Isn't that kind of upside down? I mean, because normally if you had a master sign plan that was all in accordance with the sign code, there would really be no grounds for aldermen to bring that back then. It'd only be if there was a waiver to that sign code that they granted in that master plan. And then that would be the basis for the alderman to come back in, because it'd be a waiver from the approved sign code.
I think we're effectively saying the same thing. I mean, typically you would get a master sign plan for a property where you are looking to deviate from the regulations that otherwise might apply in terms of, total number of signs or locations, those
I was going to
types
say
of
that's where we
concerns.
tend to use those.
Right.
Is where you
So it's-
the total impact of the totality of the total number of signs would exceed normal code provisions, but where it actually might make sense for a larger campus like a Concordia, or maybe the pavilions and everything that's going on within that development.
So it's kind of the same thing, but it wouldn't apply to, just a single sign that, the business put out, the monument sign that the new building put out in front just by itself. That's not contemplated by this, even if there was some waiver that was granted. To that, it's really that bigger picture master sign plan that's part of that process.
So do you think it's important that the common council should be able to, if there's a single monument sign that's put inside that's contrary to the sign code because the planning commission grants a waiver to it for reasons, that we should not be able to take a look at that? Especially since if we have
That's for us to decide.
residents inside that area are in protest of that?
Well, what I can tell you is that we can certainly include that as one of the policy discussions of how broad we want to make this kind of review approval apply, and include that as part of that process.
Okay. I had just one other one aside, just
Go
a
ahead,
short
yeah.
little note. It was the old 62-16, it's now 62-14A2. And it just had to do with the time frame for a repair on a sign. It was giving the person 60 days inside of that. I don't know what the common council goes with, but I think 60 days is to repair a sign is a pretty long period of time, and that should be dropped down to, about 30 days for once they get notification. So we can have something that's in total disrepair for, 60 days instead of having them take care of it right away.
Yeah, I think we could address something related to that. I mean, I think there may be some signs that if they're particularly complex, wall sign, for example, might require more time because you need to fabricate a new part or something like that. But I think we can address that within this language, that at a minimum, we need to have the specific plan for how you're
Yeah, maybe
going
just
to
have a
address
plan in place so that,
Yeah.
by 30 days to do it.
Yeah.
All right, Alderman Parrish.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Attorney Sajak. I hope former Mayor Worth is watching all this. He would have absolutely just eaten this conversation up, as you know. So,
I fully expect to get a call from him
yeah,
after
you will.
this evening.
You will,
so.
and he may have some good comments as well. I did find it I like to prepare and read all this stuff, and I did find this a little more difficult to prepare for, and would appreciate a red line. Just after this meeting, it would be a little easier. I know it would be like Swiss cheese was your point in the memo, but it is hard to figure all this out. My district is along District 6, which has most of the west side of Port Washington Road essentially is all of my district. So I am getting notifications at least minimum once per week of some business getting written up. So hopefully part of your recommendations analyzed all the fines and all the staff time trying to administer the current code, and maybe identify where things are taking, there's certain things that are being written up over and over again that I'm seeing. I'm thinking specifically a couple of things. One, in a multi-tenant building where each one of those businesses wants a little sandwich board sign about their little sale going on or what have you. And I read this to be one of those per property. So if you wouldn't mind, you don't need to answer that today, but just please speak to Director Tollefson and make sure we're not setting up something that's impossible to administer as well.
I can tell you that kind of concern is one that we've talked about as we've gone into this process, and it is one of the policy areas that we do intend to look at and see if we can address. So
Yeah, and then those marquee signs where it's like a they blow in the wind and it's tall and it angles over. All the businesses love those, and they get written up like immediately, I think, for those. And so I get a lot of complaints about that. So that's really my comment. That's actually the gist of I think the things we do. And then I noticed that we have a provision in here for the library, and I guess I was surprised that we're carving out the library, and I guess hope that Director Mushin can weigh in that with you at a later date and make sure that the library agrees with what you're saying there and that it's practical on a day-to-day basis. But overall, good job, and more discussion to follow.
Yeah, thank you for some of those comments about the finer points within the code. Alderman Parrish, I think that attorney's update is tended to focus more on the legal aspects, but there are some of those, we talked about that the other week in the staff meeting, where there's like the top 5 or 6 small things that have been sitting on the back burner for a while that are going to get wrapped into this as we go. They weren't ready for tonight, but we're going to put them in there as it progresses to Planning Commission, and then it'll go through them and then come back through us again. This is more of just the appetizer. We'll have the full meal another night.
Right. Yeah. Effectively, we wanted to just make it clear that these are the changes related to Reed and the case law, and then to bring policy into the discussion afterwards, so that we knew that we were looking at changes for 2 different reasons. So just to clarify it.
Alderman Tlaco.
Would you be able to give me the background about the blue signs and how those came about?
Yes, effectively.
We have 3 hours.
Yeah, I mean, as quickly as I can. The proposed sign code as it related to public properties and right-of-way at the time it was adopted did not allow for any of those types of directional signage that you would typically see. There were a couple property owners that came forward and objected to that they felt that it was a fairly critical component to their operations to have those types of signs, and there were enough council members that were sympathetic to that plight that they wanted to include those signs, or at least the opportunity for those signs within the code. Now, with that said, we did, in an attempt to try to minimize it as much as we could, put restrictions on it related to, you could only have one within, so many feet, within the roadway. We limited it to certain roadways, not all roadways, those types of things. But it was designed really to address the concerns of some business owners that had come forward and said that they really felt they needed to have that sign.
Yeah, we had a long-standing tradition of having a few blue signs throughout the city with no real solidly documented process. And then Reed basically said, well, you can't call that a directional sign because you're telling us, by the fact that you are telling me it's a directional sign, you made a determination about it. You're using your judgment to say that's needed, but this other sign isn't. So that was where we were potentially getting into a little trouble legally with Supreme Court decisions that were coming down. So we tried to address that as best we could without prohibiting them outright. But maybe we can make a small tweak now to perhaps contain them more, but it nonetheless remains an option for people.
Yeah, my only comment pertaining to the blue sign is that you did it by Villa Grove Park. I think it's actually been useful because it grabs people's attention. Google Map has it at a different address than what it is, so people see that sign. So I do see some of it being useful for maybe harder to find businesses.
And that's our
parks.
park, so we can probably put it there, but it's really, it is maybe harder to find businesses that are in the more rural parts of the city, or right. Trinity Lutheran Church, for example, I think has 1 or 2. Alderman Bach.
Just a quick question. By rolling the dice on the gas station electronic signs. There's no intent there to open up electronic signs for more businesses, or the goal is to keep electronic signs out?
That would be my recommendation, I think, just based on the longstanding policy of the city, to basically discourage those signs. And I think that, as I say, really we'd try to classify those signs more in a purely informational kind of category, as opposed to pure commercial, to try to address some of that risk. But there is some risk. But I just, as I said, it's the one that I don't know that there's a good answer to, because it's such a critical component of what we all, I think, envision gas stations to be. So it's one of those that the courts give us, hey, here's this great decision, and they don't necessarily think it all the way through about what it means for every instance, because it's not necessarily the question immediately before them. So
Supreme Court justices don't fill their own cars. They got people for that. Any further comments or questions? It's a good discussion. I think if it stimulates thought, there's time to email it into the attorney or Director Tollefson as we go through this process. I'm sure as everyone goes home tonight and continues to think about it, ideas will continue to come forth about specific policy things, in addition to the legal aspects that we could put forth, and wrap this all up in one measure while we're working on it. So if there's no more questions or comments, checking around, I'm not seeing any, we can move on to reviewing our future policy items, or the Committee of the Whole planning calendar, and any potential future items. That is on page 65 and 66 of the packet. So next month, we're looking forward, we have TID 4 and 5 streetscape zoning and incentives, and then community development operational analysis. So it'll be the community development show next month. And if there's any other ideas, we can bring them forth here. Alderman Bach is raising his hand.
Yeah, I have one potential that I've talked with Director Tollefson a little bit about, from a resident on the bluff on Lakeshore Drive, with a new addition of the Vermont Park steps. There's been requests from at least one resident to do something similar. And so we got into this whole discussion about structures, and Director Tollefson, in discussions with me, suggested this might be a good place to kind of have a discussion about that. The resident was going to put a formal request in writing. Super nice guy, just wants to kind of open the discussion. So that's a suggestion.
Was there we're going into a period where construction is not likely to occur. Is this something we could maybe get to early in 2024? I know there's a little more flexibility in that calendar, a little bit farther we move out. Administrator Jones is shaking his head yes. So we'll look at a spot to get that in there. I think that'd be a good topic to discuss. Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned from Committee of the Whole, and does anyone need a break? I'll check. If not, okay. We'll immediately convene as the Mequon Municipal Water Utility Commission. Please call the meeting to order and call the roll.
Commissioner Strelchuk is absent. Commissioner Tlako.
Here.
Commissioner Meyer. Here. Commissioner Hanchard.
Here.
Commissioner Bach.
Here.
Commissioner Parrish.
Here.
Commissioner Schneider.
Here.
Commissioner Gebhardt.
Here.
And Commissioner Nurbin.
Here. First up, we have approval of the meeting minutes from last month's meeting, August 8th.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes are approved. Brings us to our one and only item, or the review of the draft water utility master plan. So this is an update. We'll get some feedback to the staff, and I think we'll have it back for final approval at a later date. Is that correct? All right, just wanted everyone to be properly centered. Take it away, Mr. Voigt from City Water.
There you go. So thank you for your time. I'm sure you may have questions after the presentation, but we've got a brief presentation just providing you with an overview of the draft master plan that we've created. Before I get started, I just wanted to introduce you to Eric Fulsis. He's an engineer with City Water, and Miranda Durbin, she's also an engineer with City Water. They did the lion's share of the data mining for the master plan, and also put together quite a bit of the master plan itself. So if there's any questions, I'm sure they could probably answer them towards the end. Okay, so the goal of the 2023 master plan is to provide the commission with a history of the utility, how we got started, where we came from. Also provide you with current condition of the utility, where we're at currently, and to provide you with a roadmap of the utility moving forward. So where do we think we should go, and where do we think we should grow? Going through this presentation, we kind of followed the request for proposal for the master plan. So there were 7 key categories. The first one being water demand. As a water utility, obviously one of the key things you need to be aware of is your water demand as a utility. So the water demand tends to follow customer demand, and our customer demand has been slowly growing. It's been very steady, which is a positive thing. It's very easy to predict, and the utility's been blessed with that steady growth of the utility. We also, as a component of water demand, you have to look at your non-revenue water. Non-revenue water is water that the utility purchases from our suppliers, but we don't sell it to a customer. So obviously we don't receive any revenue. Every utility has non-revenue water. Every utility also tries to manage that non-revenue water and minimize and maintain that as small as possible. The next category is customer assessment. We looked at all the different customer classes that we have at the utility. The vast majority of our customers at the Mequon Water Utility are residential. It's over 90% of the utility is residential customers. We have experienced that steady growth at the utility, which is great. It's predictable. And that there is a lot of opportunity. That was one of the things that we determined as part of doing all the data mining for the master plan is there's just quite a few people that live on an existing water main and aren't currently customers, so we refer to them as on main not using. There's also still over a dozen what we refer to as water trusts, you might call them subdivision well systems, that are nearby mains that could obviously convert to the utility. We do have quite a bit of new development within the city of Mequon, so that also is an area of potential growth for the utility. And then most recently, obviously, the new service area of the village of River Hills. Another category that we looked at was water supply. We are blessed with our location, our geographic location. We're right next to Lake Michigan, which has over 4 quadrillion gallons of water, which is virtually a limitless supply. We therefore have contracts and purchase our water from 2 water suppliers. Milwaukee Water Works provides us with 80% of our water supply. It's the primary water supply for the city of Mequon and the village of Thiensville. North Shore Water Commission provides us with water for the village of Bayside and soon the village of River Hills. And that's about 20% of our water supply currently. One of the things that the DNR wants all water utilities to be able to do is to supply your entire utility if your largest source of supply is out of service. Fortunate or unfortunately, we've had that tested twice. There's a single supply water main that comes up 76th Street from County Line Road. It's unlooped at that location. We've had 2 main breaks on it, and during the duration of both of those main breaks, we were able to provide water supply to the entire utility via the North Shore Water Commission. So we know we can do it. We've had it obviously tested with those 2 outages. We do, however, struggle to provide adequate pressure, not adequate, but high pressure on the high side of the system, the west side of the system, because North Shore feeds from east to west, and when you get to the far west side, Milwaukee has a higher pressure than what we provide from North Shore. So that is one of the areas that we've identified as a need, and that's where the third connection to Swan Road becomes important, because that is a second connection to the Milwaukee Waterworks. It solidifies our water supply, provides us with that third major source of water. It increases redundancy within the utility, and it's obviously going to provide water supply for the Swan Ridge development. Distribution system assessment. This is a strength of the utility. We are fortunate in the fact that we are a young utility. 97% of our mains are plastic. A lot of the more mature utilities to the south of us have a lot of metal mains, so cast iron, ductile iron, things of that nature. The last 2 weeks I've spent in the village of Fox Point repairing some of those 1930s cast iron water mains. So the fact that ours are plastic and are less than 25 years old is definitely a strength of the water utility. Also, as a growing utility, we have a lot of dead-end mains, so we need to look to loop those wherever possible. This increases redundancy. Obviously, if it's a dead end and you have a main break, you cannot feed anything beyond the break until you repair it. It also improves water quality because you get circulation of flow, and it improves fire flow because if you have water fed from both directions, it provides greater capacity. Financial performance. This is one of the strengths of the Mequon Water Utility. Our revenues and expenses have grown very similar, at a similar rate and steadily over the last, since inception in 2009. The little red dashed line that you see on that map or that chart is what the Public Service Commission lists as their benchmark for where they want water utilities to be performing as far as their rate of return. Historically, it had always been about 5%. Back in 2022, they bumped it up to a little over 6%. I think it's 6.1 or 6.2%. And the reason for that is because interest rates have gone up, obviously, dramatically. So they realized that most utilities' cost of borrowing and their cost of obtaining money has gone up. So therefore, they bumped up the rate of return to reflect that increased cost of capital. We're also steadily paying off our bond. We reissued the bond back, I think, in 2017, but it matures in 2029. So if we continue on this path, we will, in 2029, be debt-free. Key principles. In the master plan, you obviously have all had a copy of it and can read through it. There's quite a few of them, a lot to list, so I thought I'd just stick to the 2 key takeaways from this component. One is that we've stayed true to the intent or the reason that the city acquired the utility in 2009. The city wanted to acquire the utility to reduce water rates and maintain stable rates for all the ratepayers, and we've stayed true to that intent. We also have added clarity where the utility has found ambiguity in our code. So in 2017, we created the Water Trust Depreciation Valuation and Condition Assessment. We had identified that water trusts had kind of a cloudy or a vague understanding of how to convert over to the public water utilities. So we created this, depreciation valuation condition assessment to help them along that path. And then furthermore, in 2022, we created the water connection policy, which helps all of our customers understand how to connect to the water utility. It provides a roadmap for everyone to understand how to connect. So This is our second master plan. The first master plan that we came out with was in 2017. So one of the things that you like to do with the master plan is use it as your roadmap and help guide the utility on where you want to go. So what have we accomplished since the original master plan in 2017? Well, of the things identified, we had identified that we needed a critical system loop into Thiensville, one of the three main crossings into Thiensville and across the Milwaukee River. And 2 years ago we closed, or 4 years ago I think now, 4 years ago, we closed that critical system loop, and we now have a water main in Bunt Rock down into the village of Thiensville. Another thing that was identified was a second connection with the Milwaukee Waterworks. And the Swan Ridge development now, we have a second connection in the works to Milwaukee Waterworks. It should occur sometime in 2024. So we've worked towards that goal. We revised our revenue credit and updated that over the past 5 years. And we've also implemented a meter change program, which was identified as a need. And we have changed over 20% of our water meters within the utility. And then finally, infrastructure replacement. There were several metal mains within the system that were systems that we had acquired water trusts over time. One of them that we recently replaced was the Range Line Court subdivision. There's an old ductile iron water main. We were going to do the road, and we chose to replace the water main with plastic at that time. And the final task or item that was on the proposal was implementation plan. This is the roadmap for the next 5 years of the draft 2023 master plan. Each category has achievable goals that are identified. We can look back annually and determine our progress towards those stated goals, and this allows both staff and commission members to utilize this document for reference. Any questions?
I'm sure there's at least one or two. Thanks for that update. I found the revised master plan very informative, and it gave a lot of info that have been persistent questions over time, but I'm sure there's still more questions, so we'll open up the floor to any water commissioners who have them. Commissioner Bach.
Yeah, I too thought that was a great summary. I mean, there's a lot of information in that report. We were just chit-chatting here, but it was good to learn the whole history of the utility and how this all developed, and all the charts. I was a former math teacher, and so when you read all that report, there's a lot of mathematics in there. One of my favorite activities that I used to do with middle school kids, I wrote a water unit. Because, and it was mostly on conservation. So it was taking how many gallons are used, when you brush your teeth, for example. Do you turn the water off when you brush your teeth, or do you keep it running? Flushing the toilet. What businesses use the most water? How many gallons of water are used to fight a fire? And we wrote all kinds of problems on that and did a whole unit, basically, and the kids were amazed. So I guess I have just two quick questions. One was on kind of the conservation of water. Is there any education that the water utility does on how to conserve water? Because we take it for granted here next to a Great Lake, but there's so many people in this country and in the world that would go crazy for a Great Lake, and so is there any education piece on conserving water? And the second question was for the people that are on the main and not connected. Have you thought about any kinds of plans? I don't know what the finances would be to offer some kind of connection coupon, or some kind of if you connect in these 3 months. I'm assuming it's the lateral that's expensive for the resident, that you could get them to connect, and then maybe the payback would be later on. Anyway, those are my two questions.
Sure. In regards to the conservation, it's an excellent question. Water utilities throughout the state that get their water supply from wells are actually required to have a conservation component to their utility, and they do I wouldn't say market, I guess educate in regards to conservation due to that. But with the treated Lake Michigan water supply, it's not a requirement of our utility to do that. Not to say that that's not a good idea. So that's definitely something that we would be interested, or would look to provide if the Water Commission wanted us to go about that task. The interesting fact is, when I first started at We Energies in 2001, the average customer of the Mequon or the We Energies water services at that time used about 18,000 gallons on a quarterly basis, somewhere in that neighborhood. And if you look at our current residential water use divided by our residential customers, it's under 15 now. It's, there's been quite a bit of conservation just due to things like in the industry, like low flow toilets, low flow sinks, and things of that nature. So conservation's come along, all by itself, which is rather interesting. In regards to, the on-main not using, We Energies used to do where they would provide a incentive for people to connect to the water utility, and that's something that the commission could look at and determine if that's something that they wanted to implement for people along Maine that are interested in connecting. That's something that if at a future date you wanted me to kind of provide the history of what they did and why, I'd be happy to.
Any other comments or questions from the commission? Commissioner Parrish.
Thank you. Just bear with me. I have about just under 5 minutes of comments, but I did have the privilege to meet with the mayor and Director Lundin and Mr. Voigt and Eric over here to discuss this wonderful report because we have had a lot of concerns about our water capacity as we're growing. And so every time we're like, well, where are we at with this? And how do, I feel like you've answered so many questions that it is going to be a valuable tool moving forward. My understanding of the scope of this is that Director Lundin and yourself wanted some feedback to incorporate into the final report so that we can then adopt it next month. And so in the spirit of having spent hours reviewing this and meeting with you, I'm just trying to offer feedback on behalf of my colleagues, maybe even tell you what I found really interesting. So I'm just going to kind of go here and just maybe take some notes, and then this is all not necessarily even for you to react to unless you want to educate my colleagues further. But one of the items you brought up was the Whitman Place booster pump issue, which I fully don't understand. I don't really want an explanation now, but if that needs to be in the final report, I think it should be discussed in there as a risk to the utility and what we should be considering. Your report wisely focuses on GIS, and that is for two reasons. One is that the GIS will help us do two things. One, it's going to help us identify theft. So I actually learned that there could be users taking water from us, but we don't even know about it. They're just hooked in. So this GIS tool is going to be a tool for them to see where all the laterals are plugged in. I'll come back to that. The GIS is also going to help promote the connection to the on-main not using, which represents almost 560 residential units that could be brought online without impacting the 20% threshold, which I'll come back to. There appears to be a 17% leakage or loss coming, which you said was it's normal that there's a loss out of the purchased water. This amounts to approximately $230,000 in purchased water per year. So if we can narrow down where that loss is, especially on the theft side, perhaps we could cut that number in half. I would challenge it, maybe, what is the goal for that? So maybe identify the goal and how are we going to get there? Did you want to feel free to butt in here? So.
Yeah, the goal for non-revenue water, it's always the goal to get into single digits as a percentage. So if right now we're around that 18-20%. So cutting it in half is about the goal. As you get into lower and lower single digits, the cost return on that, you're spending more money to track it down than you would be spending purchasing the water. But you're right, cutting it in half, and then instead of $230,000, somewhere around that $100,000 would be the idea.
Can't get my oh, it did. And all I was going to say is the expectation should never be that it's zero. There is natural loss of water that should be expected in the system for things that aren't metered. So just to be clear, the goal would never be to get it to zero.
Great. And believe it or not, GIS is maybe the starting point to that process, I learned. So that would be, how can we get going on that? Your implementation chart on page 50 is amazing. I just wanted to recommend that you add an estimated cost per period for each item so that we could, even if it's just like a range, so for each item, whether it's quarterly or annually, just so we have an idea of what we're talking about, multi-millions or pennies. And then consider, not asking, I'm just saying consider adding a priority level so that we can maybe not focus on less prioritized things. Okay, so the biggest part I think that led to us doing this study has to do with this 20% threshold. And our policy right now is, I would call it almost a policy of like consent by silence. So short term, basically we're not allowed to grow. Jim, can you just explain it for my colleagues quick so I don't?
Sure. In our contract with Milwaukee Waterworks, they had a formula that they did not want more than 20% of the customers to be new customers or customers that the property had not been developed before the inception of the water utility, which was 1998. So if you look at, like all the development in the central growth area, well, that would be considered new or would fall into that 20% threshold, where existing customers, like if you pick up like Huntington Park, or you pick up Park Place or Beechwood Farms, or those were subdivisions that were obviously the homes had all been developed before 1998. That would fall into the the 80%, the pre-existing. So they didn't want the new customer growth to be more than 20%. So the discussion or the debate internally within the water utility is two things. One is Carrie Lewis, who used to be the superintendent of the Milwaukee Waterworks, she used to ask about every other year where were we at in regards to that percentage. So we would always come up with the percentage number to provide her with, so she knew where we were at. No one has asked since Carrie left the utility, so I'm not sure whether or not there's any interest or focus on that issue anymore. The second part of it is, twofold. One is it's been a quarter of a century since the original contract. So since we originally signed the contract with Milwaukee Waterworks as We Energies, it was 1998, and we're now in 2023, 25 years later. And per PSC, they really can't shut the water off. So those are all questions. I understand your point, Brian, and I appreciate it that we should address it. Should we sit down and talk with Milwaukee and basically bring up the fact that it's been 25 years? Should we, where should we go with this?
Sure.
My personal feeling is we should try to get that out of the agreement going forward the next time we go to amend it. As at the time it was imposed, it was pretty clearly intended to limit the growth of the suburbs with respect to the city of Milwaukee. It is kind of a protectionist thing. I'll bet it would get struck down today. It also carries with it no penalty if we go over it. And Milwaukee Waterworks has a ton more water now than they did in the late 1990s because industry has fled the city. The city's actually shrunk comparative to then. They want to sell this water to people because they've got this huge capacity to produce it, and there's not as many people consuming it. So
Thank you. So I guess just to finish my thought, and I guess the request, just because that was your request for request. So just so my colleagues know, the quota is 20%, but we're currently, depending on how you slice it or dice it, we're at 23 to 30%. So we're way over. So long term, short term, I think it's fine. We have cheap, abundant water. There's no issue. There's no fines. No one cares. No one's saying anything. They keep allowing us to hook in new development. So I get it. But I feel like our role as the policymakers is how do we keep this spigot on forever, or minimize the cost to the taxpayer over time. So I guess my request would be, and I believe I requested this at the last meeting, no offense, city attorney, but would be for the city attorney to actually review the contract by the time we adopt this and write a recommendation, not as part of this document, because I believe this is a pretty public document, but so that the council can adequately weigh the risks of continuing to go above this 20%. I guess I was pleased to just hear the mayor say, well, maybe we should look at that, because I think that would be a major policy change over what we've done historically. And then my final request is that, as you know, we're looking at doing the southwest side industrial park at the southwest side of Mequon. It's very early stages. The city has made no commitment whatsoever to do this project, but we're gathering data inputs. Well, this is 200 to 400 acres we're talking about bringing online, millions of square feet of potential industrial space. So I guess I would like to know what would that do to that percentage? Is that going to put us at 50%? Once fully built up, because that could affect our desire to proceed with that project on the southwest side. Because our number one priority is to keep this spigot on for our current customers, I think. So those are all my requests. Thank you for the time and for listening.
Well, thank you very much. Yep.
I believe I heard our Mr. Voigt say that they can't turn the spigot off on us. It's illegal for them to turn the water off.
Forever.
So no one's turning the water off. That said, I think we should just work to get that struck from the contract. It's an antiquated provision that probably doesn't hold any water anymore, pun intended. Does anyone else have any comments on the content of the document? Are there any thoughts on, I think Commissioner Bach brought it up. Is there any way we have several people on Maine not using. There's been a desire in the past that we shouldn't be doing marketing because we're not a mandatory utility. I'd like to poll people's support for the concept of education. My theory is there's several people that are on Maine not using that have no idea it's in front of their house because properties have transacted in the last 25 to 30 years and they may not even know it's there. We might pick up a few customers. It'll cost us absolutely nothing because the main's already in the ground. I think it'd just be a simple flyer to people that are on Maine not using and just letting them know we exist. And there's no pressure to sign up. It's their choice.
That's
not
the key
compelling
thing.
anyone.
Yeah, that's the key thing. Per the referendum, we can't force anyone who has a private well to connect anyway. So this is just an option. This is just allowing or providing people with the information that, hey, you have a water main in front of your property. This is an option for you to connect should you be interested, but there's no pressure for anyone to connect.
And just as a reminder, we intended tonight to be the discussion and overview about the document itself. So we're not otherwise presenting the overview of the implementation or the next steps or our plan moving forward because we wanted to ensure that the document met the expectations of the commission before doing so. So we're here today to take your feedback, and in October, when we have the discussion, that's when we'll be highlighting the implementation plan, the budgeting strategies, and those recommendations to consider things like the proactive education that we've otherwise spoken of.
Is that something people are generally okay with? Show of hands? Yeah, we're not strong-arming anyone, but I think people just don't know we exist sometimes. Despite our best efforts. Sorry, Jim. Commissioner Hancher.
I live in Huntington Park, and so Swan Ridge Farms is going to be hooked up to the water. We're not hooked up to the water. We have a community well.
Yep.
So I don't know if it makes sense because they're going to have water. If financially for Huntington Park to consider something like that.
Jim's been in discussions with Huntington Park. We mandated that the development otherwise stub out the utility to provide the opportunity for Huntington Park, and it's our understanding that they're going through their own capital analysis to otherwise determine whether it makes sense for them to connect.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But even if they decide not to now, again, the Swan Bridge Farm development will otherwise stub water main into the connection of the roads that are made, so they could do so at any point in the future.
And I don't know what the cost would be to change over from a community well to the water.
And that's what that spreadsheet that we put together in 2017 allows all of the private water trusts to easily do. Huntington Park just has the privilege that they essentially have little to no main that they would otherwise have to extend for that connection. Not all private trusts are in that same situation. There are others that may need to make longer connections in order to make it work.
Yeah.
But we've gone as far as having that spreadsheet available for the private water trusts to be able to do exactly that evaluation.
Yeah, especially if they do develop west of Huntington Park onto the southwest corner. So it would be kind of like an island on itself with a, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I would just want to make sure that everybody has the correct information and maybe make choices.
Any other feedback from the commission? There's still time to get feedback in even after this meeting. So if you think of anything, this will be back next month, correct?
Correct. We wanted to, again, take any feedback so that as we transition the document from draft to final and then bring forth our recommendations based on the analysis that we had this discussion first. So we will be back next month requesting acceptance of the document and including those recommendations.
Perfect, thank you. Noting that, is there a motion to adjourn? We've got one more meeting to get to.
So moved.
Second.
Motion is second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And we are now adjourned. We will immediately reconvene here as the Common Council. Call the meeting to order and do the Pledge of Allegiance. For those just joining us, let's do the roll call again.
Alderman Strelchuk is absent. Alderman Talaco. Alderman Meyer. Here. Alderman Hancher.
Here.
Alderman Bach.
Here.
Alderman Parrish.
Here.
Alderman Schneider.
Here.
Alderman Gebhardt.
Here.
And Mayor Nurbin.
Here. First up, we have personal appearances and public comment. Citizens wishing to address the Common Council in any matter not on the agenda may do so at this time. If you desire to be heard on any agenda items, you may be heard when that item is considered on the agenda. Please speak into the mic at the podium. Time limit is 5 minutes. Is there anyone here who wishes to speak on any item not on the agenda? I don't see any. So we'll move on to public officials' reports. First up, I've got a couple of reports. First, catching up on a few things that happened over the weekend. One you probably knew about and one you may not have known about. First, Taste of Mequon was held here this Saturday, right on the steps of City Hall. Hot Rod Huey and the B-sides rocked Taste of Mequon pretty hard. They were great. So if you missed them, you really missed out. I'd like to thank the Festivals Committee for putting it together. It's fantastic. It really takes a year-long effort to get it organized, but then the effort to pull off the event on the day of is very intense, and that requires a lot of help from other people. So police department, thank you for providing security. Southern Ozaki Fire Department, thank you for being there in case of a medical emergency. And of course the DPW, who shows up early and stays late and works really hard to make sure we can have fun one day a year out on our steps of City Hall. So thank you to all involved. Also over the weekend, Super Steel, which is now a Mequon company in our Mequon Business Park, celebrated their 100th year anniversary. They're in the old Telesmith building right next to our DPW facility. They're really nice, quiet, respectful neighbors, and they make amazing products right here in Mequon and employ just shy of 200 people, and they're growing, and they've got an amazing story. So check them out online at supersteel.com. So that's it for the weekend update. This isn't Saturday Night Live, it's Tuesday Night Live. Next we have a proclamation for Rail Safety Week in 2023. So we've got railroads here in Mequon, and we have to learn how to coexist peacefully with them because they're not going anywhere. So here we go. The proclamation from the City of Mequon recognizing National Rail Safety Week. 2,194 rail grade crossings collisions resulted in 803 personal injuries and were responsible for 274 fatalities in the United States during 2022. 1,208 trespassing incidents have occurred in the United States, resulting in an additional 658 pedestrians being killed and another 550 injured while trespassing on railroad property rights during 2022. Educating and informing the public about rail safety, reminding the public that railroad right-of-ways are private property, enhancing public awareness of the dangers associated with railway grade crossings, ensuring pedestrians and motorists are looking and listening while near railways, and obeying established traffic laws will reduce the number of fatalities and injuries. The International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Operation Lifesaver, United States Department of Transportation, and all local, state, and county and railroad law enforcement officers, first responders, and railroad corporations commit to partnering together in an effort to educate at a national level all aspects of railroad safety, to enforce applicable laws in support of National Rail Safety Week. Accordingly, I, Andy Nurbin, Mayor of the City of Mequon, on behalf of all citizens in the City of Mequon, proclaim September 18th through the 24th, 2023, to be National Rail Safety Week, and I encourage all citizens to recognize the importance of rail safety education. That's it for me. Mr. City Administrator.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Two quick updates, and while I won't be looking forward, we'll look ahead here. A few weeks from now, Ozaukee County will be hosting their second and final community recycling event for all residents of Ozaukee County. This will be taking place on Saturday, September 23rd from 9 a.m. to noon at Fireman's Park in Cedarburg, just next to the county fairgrounds. And they're going to be collecting electronics and appliances during the morning hours, including TVs, computers, laptops, cell phones, air conditioners, microwaves, refrigerators, stoves, you name it. A full list of all of the eligible items that they'll be collecting is available now on the city website. Again, the morning of Saturday, September 23rd, the last collection event of the year. And then, as we project forward to next month's council meeting, we will have representatives or guests from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation coming to our meeting to give us an update on the I-43 expansion and construction project. Work will soon begin on the Mequon Road interchange. There's been some preliminary utility work occurring near the intersection of Mequon and Port Roads for the last 6 weeks or so. That work is going to continue to pick up in earnest as we go into the latter months here of 2023. And just as we did last year, we're going to have several representatives from WisDOT here to give us an overview of the work that's been accomplished so far to date here in 2023, and to also give us a preview of what work is going to look like heading into 2024 and next year's construction season. So that'll be right at the head end of our council meeting here next month. Back to you, Mayor.
Thank you. Next, we have the consent agenda. We've got 8 sets of meeting minutes from various boards and commissions and 1 ordinance first reading. That ordinance is 2023-1654, and an ordinance amending Chapter 2 of the Mequon Municipal Code, eliminating the bond requirement for certain city officers. This was recommended earlier this evening by the Finance and Personnel Committee and is a first reading. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the consent agenda is approved. Moving on to ordinances. Ordinance 2023-1653, an ordinance amending the City of Mequon operating budget for fiscal year 2023 to adjust budgeted amounts within the Department of Public Works due to unanticipated repairs and material cost increases, and a net amount not to exceed of $36,576. This was recommended by the Finance and Personnel Committee on August 8th, the first reading at Common Council on August 8th, and is here for consideration tonight.
Move to approve.
Motion and a second. Any comments or questions we didn't discuss previously at any of those committees? Hearing and seeing none, please call the roll.
Alderman Tulaco.
Aye.
Alderman Meyer. Alderman Hancher.
Aye.
Alderman Bach.
Aye.
Alderman Parrish.
Aye.
Alderman Schneider.
Aye.
Alderman Gebhardt.
Aye.
The ayes have it. On to resolutions. Resolutions 4070, a resolution approving a state municipal agreement for a bicycle and pedestrian planning study with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. A recommendation forthcoming from Public Works.
This was recommended unanimously, and I move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second. Alderman Alderman Parrish.
Thank you. I'm sure the Public Works thoroughly vetted this. I just had a quick question. Was the total cost of this for Mequon and Thiensville $80,000?
Well, we don't have a total cost. We haven't issued the RFP. So this is just a grant, but we did otherwise include in the resolution that if Thiensville is not a cost participant, that then they wouldn't be included in the scope. So the cost will either be with the share of Thiensville's proportionate division of that local share, or it will be a Mequon only document.
Okay. I don't think I can. I'm trying to explain that I think that 20% of 80,000 is $16,000. So wouldn't we just, if Thiensville participates, we would pay roughly 85% of that. So I feel like
Well,
we're
Thiensville
approving
hasn't
a lot.
agreed to anything, so I'm not gonna speak to what theirs is, and if Thiensville doesn't agree to anything, we still wanna move forward with the grant.
Okay. And this is up to, basically up to 16,000. So if the actual amount of this agreement ends up being 60,000,
Well, it could also be more, so the grant is capped out at the 80,000. So it could also be more than that, and then the local share would be 16 plus whatever portion of the plan goes over that amount.
I could have asked that better too, so thank you. And then my other question was, can Mequon be a sponsor for a project in another community? Or would they have to join us as a sponsor for that? And do we really want to work in another community? Because isn't sponsorship, we're monitoring the project, right?
It is our grant. Do you
Yeah.
mean Thiensville? I don't know what you mean by another community.
If Thiensville ends up joining in with us on this, my question is can Mequon be the only project sponsor? Or will Thiensville
Yes,
then join
it's a
them?
two-party agreement, so it is only with Wistat and the city of Mequon.
Thank you.
But we do have a shared bike and pedestrian way committee, so
Which is what started this. We already went to RFP. We received proposals last fall, and unfortunately, the financial discussion is what waylaid us bringing it to this body for recommendation. And so when the opportunity came up to seek grant funding, we ultimately decided to do that so that we could, at a minimum, reduce the city's portion and see if we could get to a better mix where Thiensville would be willing to participate. They did give a tentative indication that they would be, but it was a straw poll vote and has no regulatory meaning at this point. So we would follow with a memorandum of understanding to work out what that cost share would be.
I think with given the ambiguity of the way you drew it up is good. I mean, if they're along for the ride, they're in. If they're not, then it's a Mequon only project. I hope they're able to participate, so it captures both at once.
And again, they gave a tentative indication. It's a matter of whether the dollar value works to everyone's satisfaction.
Any other comments on the SMA? We had a motion and a second, right? We did, okay. If there are no other comments, is this well, it's quasi-budgetary. We'll call the roll.
Alderman Meyer. Alderman Hancher.
Aye.
Alderman Bach.
Aye.
Alderman Parrish.
Aye.
Alderman Schneider.
Aye.
Alderman Gebhardt.
Aye.
Alderman Telako.
Aye.
And that resolution passes. On to Resolution 4071, a resolution approving the purchase of a replacement compact track loader with related attachments from Fabric Cat, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the amount of $89,750. Is our recommendation forthcoming from Public Works?
Also unanimously recommended, and this one is quite straightforward. It's a 1999 machine that is failing out in the field and having to be retrieved repetitively. So I think we should definitely vote positively on this one.
Was that a motion to approve?
It's a motion to approve.
Motion and a second. Any comments or questions on this item? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Alderman Hancher,
Aye.
Alderman Bach,
Aye.
Alderman Parrish,
Aye.
Alderman Schneider,
Aye.
Alderman Gebhardt,
Aye.
Alderman Telako,
Aye.
Alderman Meyer.
And that is approved. There are no specified unfinished business from prior meetings. We have a couple of items, specified new business items, 2 mayoral appointments, Lynn Streeter to the Southern Ozaki Fire and EMS Board. We're adding another member. She was a reserve member, and she'll now, if you approve, be a full-time member. And a mayoral appointment to the Hiram Schmidt Fund. Jenny Hone, who you may have seen in the news, has been nominated for Citizen of the Year. Those are the 2 appointments. Alderman Meyer.
Adding Lynn Streeter is just a perfect addition to that. She was a member of the Future of the Fire Department and was a critical member of that, and it's an excellent addition.
And she's already provided us with tons of free visioning, mission, vision, and values sessions. So she's been invaluable in getting some of that work done already on the committee. Thank you for that. Is there a motion to approve one or both of those appointments?
I move to approve both of those appointments.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And those appointments are approved. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? We're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.